As Grant said, I'm Mariela Alfonzo. I am the founder and CEO of State of Place, which is an urban design predictive analytics software that uses visual machine learning to automatically extract microscale built environment data like benches, sidewalks, and trees from digital imagery to quantify an area's quality of place and recommends the best ways to improve the public realm to optimize health, social, economic, and environmental value of communities. Ultimately, we help city makers use this data to create more livable, equitable, and sustainable places that people can inclusively access and love. So I'm excited and honored to be moderating such an important discussion with housing and community development experts across the research, public, nonprofit, and private sectors. So today we'll be delving into the topic of millennials and the missing middle housing needed to accommodate their growing families, how this is shaping urban and suburban neighborhoods, how COVID has impacted housing preferences now and into the future, and the equity implications of the shortage of affordable, accessible, inclusive housing for what is now the largest US generation. While I myself missed the millennial mark by a few years, this topic is personal to me as the tie between housing, transportation, land use, and education indelibly shaped my lived experience. As the daughter of a first-generation immigrant, single mom, eking by on a secretary's salary, raising myself and my brother with special needs, my mother still chose to sacrifice what little she had to send me to private school, as my homeschool district was severely underfunded. While this assured me a good education, it meant my mom had to drive me in the opposite direction of where she worked every day. It also meant being one of the last ones to be picked up after school each day, well past 6 or 7. And it also meant that the most vivid memory I have as a kid growing up in the low-income, car-dominated suburbs of Miami is scrounging through my mom's old beat-up Pontiac 6000 LE, looking for change in between the seat cushions. So it was the end of the month and things were tight till next payday, and we were hoping to find some change to pay for a soup at Dunkin' Donuts. It also meant I never learned to ride a bike well into my 30s. I could go on, but I have a session to moderate. I say all of this because we really can't talk about housing without speaking about access to the myriad aspects of quality of life that are inherently tied to where you live. And so this shortage of accessible, affordable, family-friendly housing and walkable, livable neighborhoods, which is the preference of millennials, is not just an inconvenience, it's a matter of equity, sustainability, and resiliency. So my question to the panel is, despite millennials' preference for urban living, the share of those living in major cities has been on the decline, while millennial migration to suburbs has been increasing, and millennial homeownership rates are substantially lower than that of generations before. Could I ask you to share your thoughts around the millennial mindset and circumstances pre, during, and post-COVID, and how your work has addressed this shortage of housing that meets the evolving needs of millennials? And please do introduce yourselves as well as you need to do that. Thank you.
So I'll step in. I'm Issi Romem. I'm an economist. I currently have my own consulting firm called MetroSight, and I'm a fellow at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at Berkeley, formerly chief economist at Julia, and before that at BuildZoom. I think before we even get to COVID, it's important to realize that millennials aren't entering the same world as their parents. I think think about the world circa the 80s. American cities were sprawling with gusto. They were growing each year. They were adding many, many square miles each year, and that was filled with housing, and that kept housing relatively affordable. We see the first beginnings of the affordability crisis that we are so aware of today only in the 70s in California, and it wasn't until later that this spread to what we recognize today very easily as the expensive, affordable cities. And the reason that happened is twofold. The expensive coastal cities have successfully curbed sprawl, or largely curbed sprawl, which greatly limits the amount of new housing produced. And at the same time, they've clamped down on densification. It's basically become illegal to build housing the way we used to in past generations by tearing down one structure and replacing it with something denser, especially in single family areas. And the result has been a new pattern that is prevalent throughout pretty much every US metro that I call the islands of density in a sea of no growth pattern. What this means is that you see growth of two types in metro areas. You see growth on the suburban sprawl, on the suburban periphery where sprawl is continuing to happen. Within the interior, you basically have low density areas that don't change and don't add any housing beyond what few opportunities there are for infill. And where there are such opportunities, we see not small, modest construction, but rather very large 50-plus unit multifamily structures cropping up either near transit hubs or in formerly commercial areas that are changing form. And so we have this bifurcation. You either get a single-family home that is typically old with a large lot, or you get a small unit in a very large building. There's no in-between. And of course, things are extremely expensive, and millennials can't afford it as easily as past generations could. If we look at the multiplier of home values to incomes, it has risen sharply over these past decades.
Thank you, Issi, for setting that macro level perspective for us. Craig, we don't see your picture, but I hope you're still there. Maybe not. So I guess, Albus, maybe you could speak to your perspective, especially thinking about the nonprofit, public, and private sectors, and your thoughts on why this issue matters and why you started in this work.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for having me. I'm excited to participate in the conversation. I just missed being a millennial by 2 years, but my name is Albus Brooks. I was the president of Denver City Council for a number of years, City of Denver, participated as a community organizer before that, and now I'm in the private sector, building housing, affordable housing, and market rate housing all throughout Colorado and Southern California. So I am excited to have that perspective in all those different lenses. And I'll tell you right now, as a young community organizer, I think we knew that Denver was one of the top 3-5 cities. We were always ranked about recruiting millennials to our city. And the thing that we'd always talk about, it was kind of twofold. And I think we'll get into this conversation of race here in a bit. But the first question was, how will we keep these millennials, these incredible, vivacious individuals in our city without moving to the suburbs? And two, how do we grow our city without gentrifying our city? And so we don't only want white, well-educated millennials. We want an inclusive city that brings together millennials who were born here, that brings together well-educated millennials, and that brings together a workforce so that they can come together. I will tell you, we figured out the former, how do you develop a diverse housing stock to keep millennials in place when they start getting married and start having kids in the city. I believe we've done a great job of that by doing a housing stock. But for the race question, it was a struggle until George Floyd. And I want to talk a lot more about where I see millennials kind of come together, and a point that none of us expected to see millennials that is driving them to the city is this equity, this purpose-driven opportunity to have equitable cities and to shape their cities in new ways and have their fingerprints all over their city. And they know that the suburbs are not offering that. And so I think the city offers a dynamic new way for millennials to begin thinking about that. I think it's going to be tough. It's going to be very interesting how we bring folks together. And I think folks, city leaders, I think private sector folks, I think community folks have to be very intentional when they're building communities around this new reality that we live in, which I call kind of the post George Floyd. I know I haven't really got into the COVID perspective yet, but the post George Floyd reality, which is really bringing millennials together. And I want to say this in the private sector. I'm having a conversation later on today, speaking with CEOs of companies who don't know what the hell to do with their woke millennials who are in working for the companies because they are demanding policy statements, they're demanding shifts, they're demanding different hiring practices, and I think that's a good thing. And so I see the future, and it's bright for millennials in cities, but it does not come without intentionality from leaders and making sure that we are giving them a vision and allowing them to be a part of something bigger than themselves.
It's a great segue into Craig. I'd love to know how you've addressed this from a public sector perspective in Montreal, and speaking to that intentionality, how that's kind of affected your work.
So hello, everyone. I'm Craig Sauvé, City Councillor in the City of Montreal, in the Southwest Borough, which is a borough that's gone through a lot of change. It was a very big industrial area, like a lot of major areas that are being developed and redeveloped and reconsidered now. We're facing all these similar questions, and now we have a very big, in Montreal, at least in the environs of Montreal, a cultural shift that's operating as well here. People want to live in the city, millennials want to come to the city. And I think what you're saying with regards to equity, with regards to a decent type of living, with regards to affordability, the city has been trying to take steps and evolve in ways that it can sort of offer more collective space. So the collectivization of resources seems to be one of the ways we can offer that equity. And that could be with good public transit, right? Instead of all of us having our separate cars, good public transit, or in terms of affordabilities, space for cyclists, space for active transit, which we're investing in massively. And these kind of things we can do with the density that we are building in Montreal and that we have been able to conserve. And one thing, talking about the COVID period that you mentioned, parks is another place that has been in huge demand. I can tell you that picnicking has become the national sport of Montrealers because it was a place where you could go outside, and before we were allowed back into restaurants, people could sort of gather at a social distance area, and our parks were facing huge strain. And we noticed that we didn't have enough green space, something that we knew already, but that we didn't necessarily realize just to what point it was essential. We all woke up with regards to that. That's something that millennials will want too. The suburban ideal that were sold to us, sold to our parents' generation basically, was that they'd have these wonderful garden cities away from the dense or dirty, dangerous industrial centers. But that hasn't been proven to be true. We've seen seas of asphalt. And so now when you have in modern cities, big, vast park spaces, streets that are greened, this collectivized space is really appreciated. And it's closer to I think the garden city desire than ever before. And another thing that I think would be interesting to help in terms of collectivizing and pooling of resources is something that maybe we're not talking about enough, but is car sharing. Because there is this idea that one must own a car, and you must, in order to have access to all the wonderful things around, and you must have money to have that car. Well, if you have car sharing, and if you allow space and you plan for space on streets that are reserved for car sharing, of course, it means taking away private parking space. Well, not private, but parking space is usually used for private cars. That can be a huge incentive, I think. That's a resource that I think many, because I know this is the Montreal example, you want to, you have a car just so you can go to the mountains around and have a time out with the family once a week or twice a week, or take the kids to a hockey practice or to gymnastics. You don't need to own a car to have access one time per week, right? If you have car sharing access, you can provide all those things. So that reduces the cost of living for people not owning a car, a better collectivization of space. So these are some of the things I think that we can do in terms of cities and land use planning in order to really re-incentivize millennials and say, look, everything you think you want in the suburbs that you think you have to go to the suburbs for, you don't necessarily need. We can provide that space inside the city, and I think it'll be more enjoyable and affordable.
Thanks, Craig. That's really interesting. This idea of the collective, of the public realm, and of the shared public realm and public resources as a way to sort of magnetize millennials, I think is really interesting, and brings me to a related point, because and this goes back to the issue of equity that Albus raised. So while the shortage of housing that meets millennials' means and needs is, of course, the challenge that we're to be discussing. This is particularly the case for Black millennials, who have a home ownership rate nearly 3 times less than that of white millennials. And this gap, especially among young people, is higher than any other time in history, essentially erasing in the US all the progress that's been made since the civil rights era housing reforms. And there's a similar, albeit smaller, gap between Latinx millennials and white millennials in this regard as well. So my question is, when you're thinking about this intentionality and the idea of the collective, how can we assure that policies and programs that are put into place to address these housing needs and keep millennials where they want to be, how does that center around the needs of the most vulnerable? Especially given that even before COVID, in the US in particular, structural racism and spatial injustices were evidenced already in the homeownership rate gaps, mobility, and racial and class resistance to affordable housing solutions. So I wonder, Issi, maybe you can set the quantitative stage for us a little bit here.
So let me try and break that down. When you think about populations that are underprivileged and don't have the same access or opportunities for homeownership as others, there are 2 basic reasons. In some parts of the US, the issue really is poverty. These people don't earn enough to buy a house at the price point that construction cost dictates, okay, the cheapest that you can build a house for. And there, the issue really is one of subsidy and affordable housing with a capital A, as Greg mentioned, or other social supports that basically transfer funds to these populations and help them obtain housing. In other parts of the country, the expensive coastal cities, the issue is different. The issue there is one of not building enough housing and making housing artificially expensive by creating scarcity. And that speaks again to the curbing of sprawl and the prevention of densification that I mentioned before. And the question there is, what housing does get built, where does it get built, and how do we allow more of it to get built? And what do I mean by that? Housing today is often built where there's the least resistance, which means that in those neighborhoods that are more affluent, less housing gets built. And the housing that does get built tends to be concentrated in places where people can't fight back. And that often means displacement. And that actually, in some senses, it helps produce more housing, but it also exacerbates the shortage of housing for the populations that need it the most and can afford it the least. One way of addressing that is through what can be called gentle densification or modest densification. And the idea here is basically to convert areas that are currently very low density, typically single family, and allow them to densify very gradually in a way that doesn't raise the same type of resistance as denser or larger development. The key example is what's called, in California at least, the ADU, the auxiliary dwelling unit, or the in-law unit, the granny flat, the second little home in the backyard, or the subdivision of a single family home into 2 units. And I can tell you quantitatively, we did an exercise at Zillow to see how much housing could be added to each of the largest metro areas using this. And the numbers are mind-blowing. You could double and triple the population of your typical American city if every single family home were to build an ADU or convert into a triplex, which could mean 2 ADUs in the backyard. And the numbers are just beyond whatever possible needs you could possibly imagine. Any amount of population could be housed in these cities through these measures. The last point I want to make here is the typical pushback to this argument that you could densify the suburbs modestly is that this would make the traffic situation unbearable and create problems in terms of infrastructure that you couldn't deal with. And that's where COVID finally fits in here. If we are going to switch to a world where a larger share of the population works from home, that means that our roads are suddenly able to handle that much more population because each person doesn't produce as many miles traveled as they used to before COVID.
Really interesting, Issi. I wonder, Albus, in your work, especially from the community organizing standpoint, and now being in the private sector side, how do you speak to this issue, especially as it relates to this pushback, right? How do you build trust and consensus?
Man, no, I feel like this question could be a seminar and a conversation all in of itself. And I'm glad that Issa kind of set the macroeconomic perspective, and I think gave us some tools for the future that we could use. But I want to set the historical context, and I know that there's folks in a Canadian context on the phone here or online here, and this may not, you may not know about this, but I'm just going to show you this book, Color of Law, which is, if you are in cities, if you are in communities trying to understand this issue of gentrification and real estate, whatever, and you don't read this book, you can never fully grasp how systemic the problem is. And if you don't fully grasp how systemic the problem is, you'll never have the vastness of the solution, right? I mean, you got to see this. And so just to set the table real quick, the GI Bill, right? Something that we all, like World War II, our grandparents fought in war. My grandfather fought in a war. Actually, African-American soldiers at the beginning of the war could not fight. They dug latrines for white soldiers. But at the end of the war, they started to be able to be in battle, and everyone got benefits, and they were able. This was actually how suburbia started. Everybody got their benefits, moved back to the city, and spread their wings into the suburbs, except over 1 million Black soldiers. So think about that. When we talk about a housing crisis and the lack of, I loved, Mariela, your point about Blacks not being able to purchase, that's generational wealth that was taken from the Black community several years ago. Then fast forward to the 50s, federal policies that begin to redline communities, literally segregated communities, and begin to take capital out of those communities so you couldn't move. So African Americans could not move to another community. We literally have a street in our city called Ray Street where African Americans could not purchase homes on the other side of the street. And so you begin to discuss that and talk about that, and you're like, okay, we got a big problem. So how do you solve that? Well, it's a big solution, and it's an offensive solution. People talk about reparations. That's repairing the brokenness of our federal government that instituted this. And I'm a believer in repairing what has been broken. And I believe we can do that in our cities. And I believe that we need to begin a strategy in targeting individuals who are low income and making sure there are opportunities to purchase homes. We have this program in the city of Denver where we are trying to allocate resources to poor families to put them on a track. First of all, they're in this program to come out of poverty, and then putting them on a track to giving them buying power and purchasing power to purchase affordable homes that we are building ourselves in the city of Denver. And so, I talk a lot about Black wealth in the midst of this kind of post George Floyd environment. Is no longer acceptable to just think about how you can diversify your businesses by getting a couple Black and brown employees. It's about changing the paradigm from board positions, making sure that the C-suite is representative of Black and brown individuals. And so I think we've got a lot of work to do, and the answer lies in us, in cities, in the private sector, in communities, beginning to pay back what has been taken, and building what true equity is. Right, is really saying, hey, this was done to you, and equity is making sure that there is not only an even playing field, but a further investment on those who have been taken.
So a quick follow-up to that, because I think a lot of people are thinking about the developer, well, they're for profit. how do you marry these two important goals? I mean, you can't, it's like I always say, like, well, I still have to make money, right? So how do you make that work?
Yeah, so I wanted to deal with that. I didn't even answer your question the first time, so I apologize. But as a Black man who is in development, I feel like I'm the Jackie Robinson out here. Every of development, and so for those of you who don't know, Jackie Robinson's first Black baseball player, just to set the stage. There are hardly no Black folks in development in real estate. Every room that I go to is all white. And so that in and of itself is transformative. And I know it because I see the looks on other owners and investors' face when they look across, like, oh, hi, but larger than that, we are trying to change the paradigm in different developments that we're working on. I don't know, many of you have heard of Robert Smith. Robert Smith he is the wealthiest African-American in America, and he spoke at Morehouse, and he paid for everybody's loans. Do you guys remember this? So this is the individual doing all that. Well, we're doing a development with him in the city of Denver in 5 Points, which is restoring a gentrified African-American community. And so I see my job as repairing. And in that job, we repair from the ownership, right? The people we're inviting to put equity in there as African-Americans, to the development team, to the construction team, to the architecture team, to the subcontractors, how we pursue and hire individuals. So that's how, Mariela, I marry the two, is they say, what does repairing the damage that has been done, what does that look like? Oh, and by the way, I do make money, right? Because it's about wealth building at this point. And, used to be like Craig in the public sector, and God bless all the folks. And now I'm in the private sector. And I think I have community activists who are upset about that. They're like, you're part of this capitalistic environment. And I get that, and I totally understand that. But looking back from my grandfather and what he did in World War II, and I know I'm talking too long, but Mariela asked a question. What he did in World War II, he fought in that war. He dug latrines for those white soldiers so that his grandson today could be about repairing and building and making money, right, in the community. And so that's, in my mind, in my heart, how I justify it.
I love it. I really love that way of describing reparations as repairing. I think that makes a lot of sense, and maybe can quell sort of people's weird visceral reaction to that word. Yeah. So Craig, from the public sector standpoint, I know things are a little bit different in the Canadian perspective, but I really would love to know how you address the needs of vulnerable communities, and maybe you can speak to this bylaw for a diverse metropolis that you've worked on.
Absolutely. So the housing sector is one of the main economic drivers for equality or inequality. Obviously, so land use and control of land is a big piece of how we can make more equitable neighborhoods and for diversity for everybody, for seniors, for kids, for students. So one of the major pieces of our current administration in Montreal is something we call the bylaws for a diverse metropolis. Essentially, what we want to do with this bylaw is to bake in or weave in affordable, off-market, and family housing into every construction permit that goes out. So it's a pretty radical bylaw in that regard. I don't think there's anything like it in North America for the time. And we also call it the 20-20-20 bylaw, because what it will now be is and there's a lot of technical aspects. It's a very long and detailed bylaw. But to give you the basics is that anything basically over 5 units of construction, the constructor, the person who's doing the development, will have to provide money or a space for 20% of it being social housing, 20% social meaning off-market, non-commodified housing, 20% for sub-market housing, We call it affordable housing up here. It's not necessarily always though. And 20% for family housing, which is 3 bedrooms or more. And obviously you can find that 20% of family housing in the off-market or the sub-market category as well. And we actually worked with both people in the community housing sector, economists, and the real estate sector. And so this is a bylaw that will actually allow developers to still make money. But there are constraints. If you want to make money in Montreal and developing real estate, and there is a big drive for people to move to Montreal, and we actually have a very low vacancy rate, and it's putting a lot of pressure on our city right now. If you want to develop in Montreal, you got to give back. You got to give a piece back. And that's why this 20-20-20 bylaw comes through. And so one of the ways that you can do, if you're doing a large development, 200 units, 300 units, we want a piece of the land. And we want it for a good price so that we can seize the land and then we can develop that into something which is non-commodified. We work with partners to make that non-commodified community, cooperative, or other housing. And so having more access to this land around Montreal, that land use will, like I said, bake in or weave in equality for a long term in a sustainable manner. So this bylaw operates in such a way. If the land is a very tight space and there's no possibility for land handover, they can pay into a fund. It's very expensive. It's actually more expensive the way we've drawn up the bylaw to pay out than to give us land because we want the land. But you can pay into a fund, and we're going to use that fund to create other projects or to do the financials, to make the financials work for other off-market, cooperative, or affordable sub-market projects. And so this is something that will be going into effect, January 1st, 2021. Something we're just passing in the final stages now. There's a majority on council of councillors who support the bylaw, so it will pass. And that's just one element that we're using, but it's something very powerful, and we're encouraging other cities to look at it. We know that there's some provincial urban planning sectors that are looking at it in Canada. There's other cities that have called us, and from Toronto, spoke with people from Vancouver. There's a lot of interest around this. So it's perhaps a tool that could fit the American needs as well. And actually in Canada, typically cities are less powerful in terms of jurisdiction than American cities. So it should be something that American cities can put in. I think it's a wonderful tool that's possible. And besides that, that's just one aspect of something we're doing. We're also investing a tremendous amount in acquiring land ourselves, the city, and then selling that off at a super cheap price to cooperative development and community housing development, and also trying to develop new innovative ways of developing sub-market housing that doesn't currently exist in the provincial models in which we're stuck in the city. So there are ways we can drop these bylaws to really concretely change the future development of Montreal. And we think just with the bylaw, just with one stroke of a pen, we can create 600 units of social housing per year. So that's something that, and we can derive millions of dollars for other projects and create more space for families, because a lot of developers as well, they're making studios or one bedrooms, because there is a lot of young urban professionals that want to live in Montreal. These are the millennials we're talking about. We want them to stay. So yes, we're making the schools, yes, we're making the parks, but we also want to provide the housing stock that can be interesting to millennials. No, it's not going to be a gigantic single unit house with a huge yard, but it will have the bedroom space needed, and then we'll provide that yard space with public parks. So that's mainly our strategy in Montreal.
Oh, that's great. I think millennials are used to making that trade-off between collective space and individual space. So I think that makes a lot of sense. But if you don't have enough bedrooms, then you can't really make that trade-off. So I think that's an excellent policy. And I think it speaks to in the U.S. And you were speaking to this, Issi, earlier regarding the even if we were just to allow for accessory dwelling units, you could get to 2 or 3 times the amount of housing that there is now. But there's this thing called single family zoning, right? And it's often illegal to do that. So, I wonder, of course, there's been implicit and then at times explicit racist motivations behind that as well. So can banning single family zoning be a path forward in addressing structural inequity, housing supply, affordability, and inclusive access to not just housing, but the quality of life services that come with that? And in that regard, because we're talking about sort of policy initiatives, there's been similar efforts or calls for defunding the police. And so while this means different things to different people, I wonder if that's another way to think about siphoning funding from policing that can be used to address these issues around equity, not just around equity in policing, but to address these built-in structural issues that have led to these spatial injustices that we've been discussing. So up for anybody who wants to take a hand on that.
I can speak a little to that. There definitely are historical ties between single-family zoning and exclusion. Single-family zoning, especially when it comes with large lots, basically makes an area too expensive for unwanted populations to live there. It keeps the apartment folks out, so to speak, and that very often has had a social element to it in American history. I don't think banning single-family zoning is the right way of putting things. I think that's phrasing things in a way that will elicit resistance and anger. Mm-hmm. I do think that relaxing single-family zoning by allowing this modest densification that I've mentioned is important, and I think there's room for new business models to be developed around that, and for changes in the way this kind of densification is addressed legally. So there has been a spate of jurisdictions in the U.S. that have suddenly allowed new construction or modest densification in single-family zones. It started with the city of Minneapolis leading the way before George Floyd by allowing, I forget if it was duplexes or triplexes to be built on every single-family area. There have been similar laws passed in the state of Oregon and in California beneath the radar, and in some counties around Washington, D.C. And that's important. What these policies often fail to do, though, is to allow additional housing to be built, but they don't allow subdivision, which means that one can only rent out these extra units and can't sell them, which in some parts of the country, the more expensive ones, can severely limit the upside to anyone going after this. So if we want developers to swoop in, buy homes, develop them with a second or third unit, and move on, that's not going to happen if these folks can't subdivide these lots and take advantage of the economic benefit. And that ties into some of the stuff that Greg mentioned. You and I might want to connect afterwards, but the policy that you mentioned in Montreal is actually a common one in the U.S. It's if I've been hearing correctly, it sounds like inclusionary zoning. And that's actually a policy that is not very clearly beneficial in terms of housing affordability. It tends to backfire and tends to make many projects that would pencil in no longer pencil in, and often amounts to a tax on development where affordable housing could and perhaps should be funded by alternative sources, not by taxing the developer, but by taxing anything else that can be taxed to obtain public funding. And I'll stop there.
I will. I'll jump in on this one, because what I haven't said is that some of my aggressive housing policies allow me to lose an election. You know, so here's what needs to happen, but you're going to get fired. So I just want to put a precursor to all the policy folks. I love, Greg, what you were mentioning. It does sound like that's a form of inclusionary housing here. What we did, inclusionary kind of failed here in the city of Denver. And what we did, I ran a bill on a density bonus. And so we added density, and it was just in my district. That's why I got fired. But a lot of folks took advantage of it, and it requires affordable housing if you add the density. If you're doing a commercial, it requires community serving businesses. So this is perfect for this kind of, I keep calling it post George Floyd era. We are doing a development right now with 4 Black owned incubators that we're going to put in the development. We're going to bring capital to the table. We're going to give them technical support. So land use, that's the most powerful thing that a city has, is the ability around land use. And we have to stack all these policies on each other. So doing an affordable housing fund, we helped lead that in 2016, where we taxed developers which I am one. I'm happily paying that into a fund, which creates 1,000 units a year. I think I love the single family kind of. I wouldn't call it a banning, but create more hurdles for single family zoning. You will get fired if you do that, but it's the right thing to do to make sure that we have enough housing stock and a diverse housing stock in the city. And so those are all things that I think are incredibly important for the U.S. Canadian cities to be thinking of. And I feel like we're following your lead in Canadian cities. You guys are doing a lot of this great work, which is really incredible. I think when it comes to defunding the police, I take a different aim at this because I spent so much time with the safety department. And even if you defund the police, and there's less police out there, and there's a police that screws up, the internal affairs are police investigating police. If you do not fix that, you have not touched the problem. And so before we get to defund, we need to get to external review. Independent review should be our focus because these cops need to be held accountable, and that needs to happen. And then when we talk about defund, I think what people really are talking about is a community policing model, which I said earlier I saw in Vancouver is one of the best I've ever seen, of a police department completely integrated into the community. Homeless. You guys don't really have a ton of gangs, but the way I see it is the way that they have social workers in Vancouver working with homeless folks struggling is the way in some of our cities that are struggling with gang violence is how we would have police officers making sure that they are partnered with community members and tackling our gang issues and our gang problems. And so those are just some thoughts, Mariela, on your very difficult questions.
I did say it was going to be easy. Craig, I wonder, I mean, you spoke, of course, to the bylaw. Are there other experiences with zoning that you could speak to in this regard?
Well, yeah, to address some of the questions that I see popping up in the chat, and as you pointed out, I mean, we did very extensive studies, two economic studies to see, one, what was the elasticity of the construction market locally, and the development market, can it take it? Will it be able to pay this out? And will it start moving off island? Montreal's an island. We'll go into the suburbs, and we also did a study about how will this affect the price of housing. And in both cases, there would be a little small boost in terms of the price of the housing, but it would be absorbed over time, because in Montreal, we've seen housing prices skyrocket for a long time, just out of the normal private market. It was too low for a long time, I think, which good low. I loved it low. I think we all wanted it low. But in terms, if you look at it from the market point of view, it was lower than normal. So now it starts skyrocketing, and this has been absorbed for a lot of people. But what we're trying to do is to bake in that off market, to create more off market space, the more cooperative space, more community housing, and that's why the land is so important. That's why taking the land and making that from those larger projects. I saw the question go by in the chat, 6 to 12 units. No, we don't take a little small sliver of land from a 6 to 12 units. We'll take the funding, and that funding will go to buying more land or to, finishing off the finances of another project. And it's not, we don't just do it with the bylaw alone. Like I mentioned, we have an acquisition fund. There are provincial programs as well that we're working with. And to speak to what Albus was mentioning about the bonus zoning bylaw, we also do sometimes, bonus zoning deals with developers if zoning is too low for what developers want. In exchange, we're going to want, off-market housing, and that's where we're really putting that emphasis. That's what we need to do. That's the permanent solution, is to find more percentage of this off-market, non-commodified housing in order to stabilize the market for people that can't afford, because affordability is being lost in American cities because people are moving back to American cities. And so that's what we're feeling here as well. And in general, I think societies, communities have to have conversations about budgetary orientations in general. So sure, it could be by police reform. I think police reform is necessary. It's something we're doing in Montreal too. Could be by refunding, taking the money from the police, putting it into social working, police or community policing. But it could also be by how much the tax rate is in general. How much is the revenue tax? How much is sales tax? What are we doing with that money? Are we properly taxing companies, or are they stocking their money in tax havens? Who's getting subsidies and why are they getting subsidies? But this is the kind of questions we have to ask society, and hopefully, in your upcoming presidential elections and in congressional elections and state, all the referenda you might have as well, that these questions are going to be asked and these debates will be had, because they have to be had in every community. But in the end of the day, I think in terms of equity, in terms of also in terms of repairing those divides between communities, housing is so key to that. I mean, and that's where the land comes in, and that's where the off-market housing comes in. Baking that in, concretely making sure the neighborhoods have a good amount of non-commodified housing, 30-35%. We're not going to be Vienna tomorrow. I don't think any cities in North America, but that's certainly a great ideal to have.
Yeah. I mean, I think that my question around the defunding the police, from my perspective, comes in because of how I started off the conversation for us around education. So I wonder if that's a way to, as Craig said, sort of like refund, right? So take some of those monies, addressing, of course, the issues that you bring up, Albus, from a policing equity standpoint, but from a just budgetary standpoint, could that be one way to address this elephant in the room, right? Because if we do not provide education, that's quality education, it's very likely that millennials will still leave, right? That's from my perspective as a non-housing expert, just from my personal perspective. Anyone want to tackle that?
I'm. I guess I got to tackle it. I mean, I think here's the thing. I think you're exactly right. When I think about education in Denver or in Colorado's last in education funding, I think we're 47th. We're the great paradox state. We're number one in recruiting a very, educated workforce, but last in educating our own. And so I'm 100% with you. I guess for me, at the state level on education, we're so far behind that defunding and taking those resources from police will just be a drop in the bucket, And so I actually think refunding the police in that bucket would actually do more for that particular context than the education. The education bucket, in my mind, has a whole reallocation that needs to happen at the state level to make sure that we have the proper funding. We have a deal called Tabor here where we can't receive all of our tax revenue on certain years, and it's a very conservative-minded approach, and we're looking to get it repealed to get more funding for schools. But I think in general, I agree with what you're saying. It depends on what context you're in, and that's what makes this thing so tough when we're talking on a national level about so many very complicated issues that when it gets done to really implement this in our own context, it just all looks different. But I think we have a lot of principles that we can stand by and learn from each other.
Great.
So, I can add to that, Mariela.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I feel like there has long been awareness of the need to spend money on education and on housing and on in other social directions to help heal. Let's call them racial wounds. I think reparations are really the news here, and I think their benefit is that they give some type of closure, some kind of formal, concrete apology for historical wrongs, and they allow people to move forward in a way that is concrete and now, whereas all the deeper solutions, although they need to happen, are slow, and we have no assurance that they will reach the goals that we aim for them in the foreseeable future. So we need to do both things. I think reparations, though, have a real need now. Now is the time for that.
Agreed.
Good point. So I just want to take a couple of questions here from the audience that get into the nitty gritty, which is what I was going to ask you about anyway. So kill two birds with one stone. So, Issi, there's Craig first. They want to hear from you regarding Montreal's success in achieving missing middle housing, which is, of course, the topic of the panel. Montreal has managed to achieve a huge amount of small-scale infill, smaller than 50 units, and at comparatively affordable pricing, less than $400 a square foot.
How? Well, I mean, I think you have to also look at the history, the recent economic history of Montreal as well. I think there's a lot of macroeconomics to do with what's been going on in Montreal. A lot of our, missing middle or triplex, duplex, plex housing was created post-war, and the neighborhoods, were protected. And we managed to. We think that density is a beautiful density as well. You can get pretty decent high density stuff, but still having 3-4 floors. Sort of Jan Gale level of density. So we protect the density in the neighborhoods that exist like that. But when we're doing redevelopments, there is a tendency to want to push for larger developments. So we try to find that good space between how can we make this human scale, but also give a good density in order to achieve, getting more land, getting more affordable housing, getting something interesting back for the community. Sometimes it's green space. And the market, I think, has been low within the last 30 years in Montreal for a lot of reasons, historically and economically in Montreal. And like I said, it's moving quickly, and we're losing affordability in Montreal. And that's one of our major concerns, because there is definitely a drive of people trying to move to Montreal. So again, our strategy really is create as much, off-market housing as possible, and create and innovate with new programs of sub-market housing, rental or purchase. And so we have a non-governmental arm's length sort of institutional real estate group called the SHDM in Montreal. They're developing some interesting models. There's also the community sector that have been developing interesting models for innovative housing. And that could be for vulnerable people, it could be for first-time buyers, it can be for seniors as well who are looking to downsize. That's another part of the market to look for as well. So that's sort of the Montreal strategy. And in the very Montreal metro sector as well, the larger cities around Montreal as well, there's definitely a tendency to want to densify on land that's not being used well, like open air parking, way too low density. So there is a move in Montreal to create density in general, and depending on the urban context, what type of density.
Great. So we have just 4 minutes left in the panel. So I'm wondering if you guys could just quickly share sort of the top 3 tools or strategies that our listeners can take away to create more inclusive, affordable housing that meets the needs of millennials, and what that process looks like from an equitable perspective. Go.
To me, the answer is very clear. You need to create more housing. What kind of housing you create is also very important, but it's second order. The first and most important thing is just the quantity. More units, whether they're luxury or low end, doesn't matter. There is a process of filtering through vacancy chains. Building luxury housing helps make housing for lower income folks more affordable as well, in short order, in a matter of months, not years and decades. And more of it needs to be built. I think COVID presents some opportunities now in the sense that it has sped up the implosion of retail and the transformation of office. And I think there will be a lot of areas dispersed throughout the metro, interior and exterior, that can be repurposed for housing wisely. There's room for new business models in this post-COVID world. And hopefully the financial system can adapt and start recognizing these new business models and funding them appropriately.
Thanks, Issi. Albus.
Yeah, I think number one, we are in a time of a great awakening. And I think it's because of COVID. And in this great awakening, we can rebuild our cities. And so to rebuild our cities, we've got to be incredibly intentional. Reparations, equity, repairing our community has to be at the forefront. I'm leading the mayor's equity task force right now, and every tactic that we have has an equity review. So if we're going to put a testing site over here, we have you got to list the reasons why we're doing it, who we're hiring, how we're going to get testing to individuals who are most vulnerable. We've created mobile testing sites. We go into people's house now. So it has to be real. So that's one piece. I think this is if you are a white millennial, this is a great time to come together with the Black community. And I can't encourage that enough. There's a lot of nervousness around it. There's a lot of thoughts around that. What can I do? I think coming together with the millennial community together, not separate, diverse, you guys can change the world. What I saw in George Floyd in the city of Denver in these protests we've seen the most change that we've seen in the last 2 weeks than in 20 years. It is incredible and it's powerful. And so uniting with those who are in the struggle is one of the most important things that you can do right now. I know that doesn't answer the question around housing, but it will, I promise you.
Craig.
That's super inspiring, Albus. Thanks for giving us this big jolt of positivity in these tough times. It's really good to hear. Just want to say that. Quick tools: plan ahead, plan neighborhoods way ahead, buy land before you start announcing all these wonderful plans you're going to do, and give yourself the tools to do so if possible. Right of first refusal, land reserves. There's something that our administration is really trying to correct in Montreal that wasn't done enough. And when you see certain groups being able to acquire land or creating public lands, that's the way to go.
Thank you guys so much. We are all out of time. This has been fascinating. We could have a whole other hour conversation, but we have to wrap it up. So thanks again to you and the audience. And just one quick housekeeping note. Please stay tuned for the next panel, Homes for All, the Future of Public Housing, which is starting at 12:05. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much.